let's throw some hot takes out there. The best formats in all of Draft League. Let's rank them all and see how my list compares to yours. I'm going to put this template in the description. Join my Discord server, link to that in the description as well. And let me know what your tier list is for Pokemon Draft League. We've got quite a few metagames here. We have all of the Fairy Gens, which are kind of the contemporary Draft League formats. We have ADV Draft League, which is the draft format for Gen 3 that Kaz and I run a big tournament for every year. That tournament's happening pretty much now. This video is going to be going live during pools, so get subscribed because we're going to be doing a lot of streams of that tournament. And then we got some specialty formats like Ubers and a low tier that we're going to add to the list. So let's start with ORAS, and this is a generation that people look at and kind of think is like this is a lot of people's favorite generation. If you look at a lot of the older players in the community, the people who've been around, this is a lot of people's first format. This was, in some essence, kind of a simpler time for Draft League. A lot of players were either just playing with, various standard sets, or like the creativity was a little bit higher because we hadn't really solved a lot that was going on in this format. And there's a lot of good memories that, people have this format, myself included, and there's still tournaments of this format to this day that are super popular. The one on Smogon does very, very well every year. It's a very common metagame in a lot of team tours, and you'll still see some of the old school players come out for it every year. Look, I'm a boomer at heart. I know Owen will give me a lot of shit for putting ORAS in S tier. This is very much a nostalgia goggles kind of take. But I do really think that this format is interesting, and it's become a lot more offensive over the years, which I think has kind of added to that. There's a lot of knocks that you can have on this format. I think the biggest criticism is the lack of hazard removal that's very reliable. Kind of limits a lot of what you can do in this format, but I think overall, this has the most interesting set of threats. I think Mega Gardevoir as a top tier threat is really, really balanced. And compared to a lot of the other top threats in Draft League, there are a lot of good ways to actually counteract that Pokemon. Which you can't really say the same for some of the other generations we're going to get to in a minute. But I think the top end is within range of everything else pretty consistently for most teams in ORAS. And I think there's a lot of benefit given to the players in-game to kind of leverage their skill. That kind of happens in these formats with longer turn counts. So ORAS for me, the best Draft League, the pinnacle. We start with the best. It's kind of weird, you know what I mean? Like we're not building up to something. We're just kind of blowing it off early here. The next one here, this is going to be a controversial one, and I'm going to leave it for a little bit. We're going to move to Sword and Shield, and this is one that I haven't played a lot of, to be honest. I've done one league of Sword and Shield. It was back with the really crappy timer. So I really don't have a lot of experience with this, and a lot of what I've seen of Sword and Shield is that it's kind of just a worse version of Scarlet and Violet, in my opinion. The metagame is where we got heavy-duty boots introduced, and as you guys have seen my teams, those are pretty common. I use those all the time. I think boots are a great item, a super awesome addition to anybody's team builder. But overall, I think this format kind of suffers a little bit from the fact that some of the top-tier threats just aren't fun to play with. We see stuff like now in the metagame developing, like Kartana round 1, like that, makes sense given how that Pokemon can be dominating. But, Pokemon like that are just super min-maxed. And I think people don't really have a good grasp on what's actually good in this format yet. I think in DPL mainly, I think there was not a lot of focus put on this format compared to Gen 6 and 7. I think a lot of the best players still preferring to play those generations. So this one feels kind of super underexplored. There's no mechanic in this game. Like if we look at ORAS has Mega Pokemon, same with Ultra Sun and Moon has those Mega Pokemon, and then has Z-moves. We'll get to that in a second. Like there's no mechanic here that we have that's useful in Sword and Shield. So I'm gonna put it in C. I had an okay experience when I played it, and I think it's slowly getting better. But I think like this metagame just leaves. It's kind of like it feels like SV, but just not. It's just not as interesting. I think there's just not as much going on in this format that's worth like exploring, or the replayability of it, where like stuff like ORAS and USUM, have those closer top ends, which allow them to have a little bit more replayability. We'll get into Scarlet and Violet next. This is the one that we're currently playing in right now. So this is our current generation. I'm gonna throw this one in A, which is probably controversial actually, but I think Scarlet and Violet has really grown on me. If you would have asked me like a year and a half ago, I probably would have had it in B or C, like around Sword and Shield, but I actually think it's a remarkable improvement on Sword and Shield. I think there are certainly a lot of broken Pokemon that were introduced in this gen, and that turned me off a lot as someone who, dude, I'm a boomer, okay? I like my old Pokemon. I like to use my ORAS Pokemon, and they're kind of all gone at this point. But I've always kind of held the opinion recently that I think ORAS and SV are a lot more similar than I think people give them credit for. The kind of underlying truths of these formats are kind of the same in both generations. They're hazard-focused metagames, really poor hazard removal in both of these generations. And a lot of the games are kind of defined around those like hazard setting opportunities and like forcing hazards up in that way. Now, SV definitely has the Terra thing, which is a huge difference from ORAS, and that's why I would say a lot of they have some of the similar fundamental truths, but not the same, obviously. But I think that's kind of why I've started to like SV a little bit more. It feels like a little bit more like a modern ORAS than it would have in the past. Now, obviously, you have really powerful, overwhelming threats in SV, and a lot of that is why I might still consider it for a B tier format rather than an A tier format. Stuff like Zarude has come up recently, been really popular, and has in times felt pretty overwhelming, but overall, I actually think this is currently the second best generation, which is probably a hot take at this point, given what people think of this format. Though, there's definitely a format. I don't want to have one tier in each format, was where it's going to end up, so I'll keep it in A for now. Let's revisit that at the end. We're going to get into one here that I definitely want to put up and talk about, and that is Ubers. Ubers is a format basically where you just allow the Uber Pokemon, which are typically banned. So we did this in BBL. I had Lunala. We did for Scarlet and Violet, and I haven't really played it outside of Scarlet and Violet. I'm going to put it in the same tier as Sword and Shield. I really didn't like Ubers, and I think a lot of it comes to the fact that it's my same complaint as I have. It's probably not as bad as Sword and, it's probably worse than Sword and Shield, to be honest. I don't like, my biggest complaint with formats is when the top end is too polarizing. And Ubers kind of solves that in a sense by giving everyone polarizing top end with the Uber Pokemon. But I think that leads to a lot of like, I use this Nuzlocking term a lot. I've started using Nuzlocking terms too much in the community. But like, it almost like every like battle feels like a box check versus like, oh, can I ever beat this Uber? No? Okay, well, I guess we can't. Let's go GG, go next. That's kind of my biggest complaint here, is I think there's everyone has something that's overwhelming that your team can't answer. And as someone who prefers a lot of these gameplays and these metagames with a lot of interesting counterplay, I think Ubers just lacks that kind of in all senses of the word. And I think it's just in that same problem with Sword and Shield, where like the top end is just not entertaining to play against. I'm sure some people love Ubers, and like, you know, this is definitely, I think, a personal taste thing. But overall, I think that the top end kind of spam of Ubers kind of builds on a problem that a lot of these newer gens have, specifically Sword and Shield, where the top end is not exciting. Same with Scarlet and Violet. Its biggest knock on that is just the top end's not fun to play against. Ubers, it's that with everyone having broken top end. Let's go into my format. I say my format, kind of tongue-in-cheek. ADV Draft League. This is, I'm gonna put it, and the reason I kind of want to include an A and B here, similar to Scarlet and Violet. I think I do prefer it to Scarlet and Violet. I wish I got more of an opportunity to play it, which is kind of why I want to put it in, you know, Scarlet and Violet in B tier, because we don't really have a B tier format yet, but we'll get there in a second. I think ADV, now look, I'm someone who loves Gen 3. Gen 3 will always have a special place in my heart, and a lot of the reason that I like this format here in A tier is, one, because the battles are a lot longer, you have a lot more play to them. It's not a lot of focusing on specific turns, like, you know, we get an IV turn, it sets up, etc. Like, there's a lot of like key turns that you're playing to, and the battles kind of play around those like 1 to 2 turns that like super matter over the course of the game. And you have the encore, you have the resist berry, etc. That's a lot of the times what happens in these newer gens, which is fine. I think that creates for interesting team building and gameplay. But I love the formats where you get into the 30, 40, 50 turn games, and you're starting to like really just like, you know, get into kind of these like wars of attrition where you're like, let's try to get spikes up as well. You know, force spikes, force chip, force win cons, deter win con. Like, this stuff is all interesting to me. And I'm going to put it at A tier. I think you could give me an argument that it's B tier. I think a lot of this format, especially why it's not going to be the best and why it's not with ORAS, no choice scarf is actually a really big hindrance to this format. Really makes counterplay difficult. 1 out of 8 teams also just stops Selakberry with Tyranitar, which like deters a lot of your speed control there. The speed control in this format is really tough, and you do have a lack of hazard removal. Now, you only have spikes to contend with in this generation. You have a lot of powerful flyers, and you have a decent amount of rapid spin anyway, and the good spikers are like Glalie, which is good, but it's a Glalie. So overall, I think this is probably A. I've kind of gone back and forth before doing this video, whether I wanted to put Scarlet and Violet in B and leave Emerald or ADV on its own in A, but I think I'm going to leave them both in A, but I definitely prefer ADV. Let's move to low tier. This is the last of our special tiers. I'm going to put this in B. I think it's a solid format. I think low tier is definitely like, it solves a lot of the issues I have with stuff like Ubers and Sword and Shield, metagames by just like removing all of the top end. I think the problem that you can kind of run into is it's hard to balance this format because not a lot of people play it frequently. So you, especially with Terra, like you run into similar box checks that you do in these formats as well. Like Iron Leaves Terra, I had that Pokemon in the LTM league that we did. That Pokemon's a box check for like all of my opponents every week. And I feel like this format could get into this range. Like I could prefer it over SEV generally, but it's one of those formats where I just don't think enough people play it to where we have optimal tier lists at this point. That I think it solves all of the problems we have here, but they still exist, even though the quality of Pokemon is a lot lower. We got our final metagame here. Now, this is what people are going to get mad at. I'm throwing Ultra Sun and Moon D. This is my least favorite, and I think the worst Draft League metagame in all of Draft League. And this is crazy. A lot of people came up in Gen 7. I played so much Gen 7. I was there when it started. I played recently. And I did a video back on, what I think of USUM going back to it now. And I can't shake the fact that the top tier Pokemon in USUM are just kind of insufferable to play with. And I personally just dislike Z moves. I think that the combination of Z moves and those top tier threats make a lot of turns that you can have counterplay. You can obviously predict the Z move. You can create, ways to kind of mitigate Z movers, no Z move. There's a lot of ways to play around this. And I think I'm certainly someone who certainly suffers from my lack of experience in USUM. But overall, I think this metagame really really pushes on the buttons of what I dislike about Draft League, which is insufferable top end. I really don't like Coco. I think that Pokemon is a little bit obscene. Zeraora got a lot of popularity. That Pokemon is also ridiculous in USUM. Celesteela is also like a pretty good box check in USUM offensively as well. There's so many of these top tier threats that are just super problematic in USUM, and Z-Move just blows defensive gameplay out of the water a lot of the time, which is how I like to play. I wouldn't think that with SV up at A tier, but I have to think it's just my least favorite format. And honestly, like I can see why people like it. People think of it like as like a polished version of ORAS, but at the end of the day, Z moves just push it, and the top tier threats introduced into some just push it out of interest for me. So that is my tier list of all the Draft League formats. As I said, tier list in the description. Let me know what yours is in my Discord as well. We'll see you guys all in the next video. And as always, have a wonderful day.